Hello and welcome to the Divine Renovation Podcast, where we seek to inspire and equip you to bring your parish from maintenance to mission. My name's Dan O'Rourke, and I'm in studio today with a few friends. It's good to see you, Ron Huntley.
Good to be here.
So good to see you. It's been a while since you and I have been in studio together, so it's fun when we get to hang out this way.
It's true, yeah. I agree.
And I've also got Father James Mallon. Father James.
It's great to be back.
It is wonderful to be with you. And today, we have a guest. We have a very special guest, Sister Nuala Kenny. So thank you so much for being with us. Now, before I let you say hello to our audience, I just wanted to share just a bit about who you are, because we could probably spend the first 20 minutes of this podcast sharing exactly who you are. You've got just so many accolades, but you are a sister of charity, a pediatrician, an internationally recognized medical educator and bioethicist, a professor emeritus at Dalhousie University right here in Halifax, as well as the author of hundreds of papers and several books. And your latest book is entitled Still Unhealed, Treating the Pathology in the Clergy Sexual Abuse Crisis. So thank you so much for being with us, sister.
I'm very grateful for the invitation.
So today we're gonna deal with a challenging topic, but an important topic, and it comes right out of your most recent book. But frankly, it's a reflection of a lot of your work in your life, and it's also something that Father James you touched on in your first book, Divine Renovation. In fact, you have a whole a chapter that speaks to it, which is the chapter House of Pain, when talking about how we can't be a right church when we just have an expression or we just appear to be correct, and so we've got a lot of the correctness but not a healthy heart.
Yeah, the external form. That's the age-old critique of religion, going back to what Jesus said. He had some pretty scathing words about that dynamic.
So look, Sister Nuala, this is a challenging topic and one a lot of people wouldn't really want to dive into, but you have. Help me understand what drew you into engaging in this topic.
Well, actually, it's part of my vocation call in that I was given in a teaching congregation the ability to pursue medicine as my ministry. I'm the only doctor in the Sisters of Charity of Halifax. And more importantly, I was able to pursue the ministry of pediatrics. So the beginning of my involvement in child physical and sexual abuse comes from my being a pediatrician. And this is an important historical thing, that when I graduated from medical school in 1972, we were only beginning in North America to understand the harms of physical and then sexual abuse that had happened throughout human history. It has always happened everywhere, in every culture, but it was not recognized for the magnitude of the damage. So during the time I was training in pediatric residency, this issue began to emerge and what was of concern to me. But my specific involvement, linking my call as a religious in the church, and you need to understand, Elizabeth Seton's Mother Seton, we're a Seton congregation, we're Be Children of the Church. I take that very seriously. So here my ministry is to children. Our foundress says, Be Children of the Church. And I'm suddenly confronted with the emergence of abuse by first religious in North America and then priests, beginning in the 1970s, right at the time that I'm finishing my pediatric residency training. So my formal involvement came a few years later when I was back in just returned to Halifax, Nova Scotia, as professor of pediatrics at Dalhousie and chief of the Children's Hospital here. I was here just a few months. I got a call. My secretary said, Sister, she called me Dr. Kenny, but Dr. Kenny, the Archbishop of Newfoundland is on the line. Now, I had worked with our Archbishop here in Halifax on all kinds of things. Archbishop Alphonsus Petty was on the phone himself from Newfoundland, where this crisis had erupted. Big time in Louisiana in the United States, and big time, first at Mount Cashel Orphanage, and that was religious Irish Christian brother abuse, and then a number of priests being involved. So the question was, the bishop is on the end of the line. He said, Sister Nuala, you're a pediatrician. I need you to come and participate to help me and our church understand what has just happened here, why has it happened, and what can we do to prevent it?
I remember I was 19, 20 years old when that broke. And I can't describe the shock, because in Canada, the Newfoundland experience for us was, if anyone's listening from the U.S., what you went through in Boston, yes. Newfoundland was ours. And it was, the trauma was huge, because I remember as a 19 or 20-year-old, I had just made a decision that I wanted to go in the seminary. I remember riding on a bus and hearing the bus drivers making jokes about priests. It was just, it shattered the world. It was like how could this ever, it was, anyway, it was huge. It was huge for
and
us.
Father James, just put this in perspective. Boston happened in 2002.
Mm-hmm.
And there are many people who, in fact, when you read histories of this, particularly, I'm an American by birth, Canadian by adoption, so I'm an equal opportunity critic. But there are people who would propose that this became the public revelations of this abuse became a crisis in 2002. I'm telling you, we were called in 1988 in Newfoundland, and we had published, and the Canadian Conference of Bishops had published. So the issue was devastating. But it was over 20 years earlier
and
in Newfoundland.
The patterns in Newfoundland, when the Boston thing came out, they were identical.
The patterns in Ferns, Ireland, in Melbourne, Australia, in the Bayou of Louisiana, in downtown Boston, Massachusetts, and in Newfoundland, exactly the same. Yep. Because that, you'll see as we begin to talk about this began to demonstrate. As I entered into this, I'm a diagnostician as a doctor. I try to figure out what's going on. If you got a really sick patient, you bring. Yeah, that's what I did. So the issue is, why is there a pattern that transcends local, cultural, regional boundaries, and it related to the culture of the church? But let me just say this: when the bishop called me, Archbishop called me. He was really responding to some kind of an amazing call of the Spirit, because the document, and folks here around the table, this is the published document in 1990.
So those who are listening, it's a large hardbound book.
Right. What I want you to know, because this becomes really important, as I know you want to talk about other things, but you need to hear this story from me. This and what we published is a landmark, recognized now as a landmark document. Because the second volume of this, which is twice the size of this big report, reviewed what was known at that time. Remember, in 1988, this thing is only emerging in the pediatric and child psychiatry world in the previous 10 years. We did a review of what was known, and then a particular attempt at reviewing was anything known about clergy abuse. Virtually nada, nothing.
Wow.
You couldn't find things. So there's another published document. So that was a brilliant move to do. And I'm an academician, so I understand that. But I'm a baby doctor. I need you to just let me tell one little story, which is why I'm still at this, Father James. When you've asked me this more than once. You just asked me the same question at the beginning. When we went to Newfoundland, there were 2 priests incarcerated in the Dorchester Penitentiary in the sex offender unit. I had to go on behalf of the commission to visit them. That's another story we may get to or not. But we decided, under the leadership of an Anglican, brilliant move. Brilliant move. It wasn't a Catholic bishop that was doing this inquiry for Archbishop Penny. He appointed the former Lieutenant Governor of Newfoundland, an Anglican, Gordon Winter, Christian gentleman of the First Order. Mm-hmm. We had one priest, a great dear friend of mine, with 5 of us. We decided 2 things. We would pursue this academic. What do we know about this?
Yeah.
But Gordon said, we have to go and listen to the people who have been hurt. And I can still remember, I just looked in the report last night for the date. We got on a school bus, a yellow school bus, the 5 commissioners, the lawyer, and our 3 support people, and went from St. John's to the Burin Peninsula, which is one of the outport areas where Father James Hickey, a fixed sexual predator in that category of offender, who was in Dorchester, had offended. legally proven against over 40 boys, and over time, probably more like 120. And these victims were all male. Mm-hmm. But what I want you to know is we went to the church hall. Mr. Winter had said we would just listen. Whatever they wanted to say to us, we would be up there to listen to their pain. So we're on the stage, standing room only. People were out the doors. And I'll just describe this. I still see it regularly when I visit this topic. He was in the third row on the right, a grovelly-looking, obvious fisherman with hard work, stood up and was pointing at us as we sat there, trying patiently and compassionately to listen. He said, "I want you to know this." And he had his Newfoundland accent. I won't attempt it. "From the day that I heard that devil James Hickey offended against my darling Johnny." Now, this was an uncle who was a bachelor in a big family, and John was the favorite nephew, very close, like a son to this bachelor. From the moment that I heard that devil Hickey offended against my darling Johnny, I need you to know that I have not stepped inside a church and I have not once talked to God. I thought I was going to die. My heart was so crushed because I wanted to run down to him and say, "Look, I understand your pain over the horrible thing that has happened to this boy, but this is the time when you most need God, not the time to turn away from God." So whenever I get kind of, I can't do it anymore, just as Father James said, because I've had dark nights of the soul. This is over 30 years. I just think of that man, and I think, thank you for all of the people who have spoken to me to share their pain, because now I have an obligation. I have an obligation I cannot not do. To work on this issue. So that's why I do what I do.
Well,
I know for me, sister, that's so powerful. Thank you for sharing. I know that Mount Cashel thing as a layperson was the very issue that, because I watched it on the news, this man who was a victim lost his court case and was going to take it to the Supreme Court. I just happened to be eating supper and watching it by myself, and the interviewer said, "Mr. So-and-so, what is it that you hope to accomplish by taking this to the Supreme Court?" And she put the microphone in front of his face. He just looked like a defeated human being, just a shell of a man. And he looked up and he just said, "I just want somebody to say I'm sorry."
Right.
And my heart just split into, I thought, what kind of an organization do I belong to that we're going to hide behind lawyers and PR people and not bring this to the truth? What would Jesus do? And I guarantee you it wouldn't be hide. He would defend that man with his life, and he did. And I thought to myself, in that moment, though, I wrote a letter to the bishop. And when I signed it, I said, "And if there's anything I can do, let me know." And I signed Ron Huntley. And as soon as I did, it was like I saw Jesus' face right before me, battered and bruised with the thorns on his head. And he looked at me right in the eye with clear eyes. And he said, "Ron, what have you ever done?" Didn't say it judgmentally, but he said, "Ron, what have you ever done to build up my church?" And I realized I was part of the problem with my apathy and my lack of engagement and involvement in the church. What have I ever done to support priests? And I realized from that moment on, I will never be a part of the problem again. And that changed my life.
Well, absolutely. So just when you said that, Ron, in this series of, both in my books, so remember, my first book was in 2012, and as we talk later, it's very interesting, that book in why I wrote it, why I thought that it needed to be written, why after all the early work, I just assumed that we told the bishops what needs to be worked on. I just assumed they were going to work on it. And then I went ahead and did my pediatric career until Raymond Leahy, now defrocked former bishop of Antigonish, our neighboring diocese, was arrested for child pornography. That's when I got back into it. So My first book in 2012 was written right after that. But here we are 7 years later. And that book was Healing the Church, Diagnosing and Treating. This is still unhealed because it goes on and on. But every single work that I do, every talk that I do starts with, and as we go on, if we do more video, etc., I have a picture of Jesus and the little children. And what did Jesus say? If any of you put a stumbling block before one of these little ones who believe in me, it would be better for you if a great millstone were fastened around your neck and you were drowned in the depth of the sea. This is the gentle Jesus.
Right.
This is
this is your hippie Jesus.
But this is the Jesus who to children, when the apostles were saying, come on, get the kids out of the way. Come on, important people have to come see the healer. Jesus said, get out of the way. Get out. Come on, let the kids come. Mm-hmm. He gave them good touch, healing touch, loving touch. Okay? I mean, he in fact said, unless we become like them, and not meaning immature, but innocent in the trusting that others would care for them, trusting in the power of God. So when Jesus says this, this is about as tough as you can get, because if there's ever a test of are we disciples of the healing and reconciling Jesus who came to show the infinite love of God, especially for the vulnerable, this is a challenge.
So, Sister Nuala, cast your eyes back to some of your early involvement and the results of your report. Surely, the church acted to address some and solve some of these issues right away.
Surely they did. Are you?
That seems pretty provocative.
I didn't know if there was a question mark.
I'm trying to get you going.
Well, I think this is exactly the issue. Going back to what did we say about culture? That transcended culture. We said that earlier. Because, let me just read. It's 2 lines. So this is 1990.
Okay.
All right? Why it happened. This is the Newfoundland Inquiry chapter on why it happened. The Commission's examination of the nature of child sexual abuse, profile of offenders, characteristics of victims, and the history of the operation of the church has led it to conclude that no single cause can account for the sexual abuses which are the subject of our inquiry. All those folks who want a single little answer,
right.
Nice little, let's scapegoat homosexuals, let's scapegoat
not married priests.
Mandatory celibate. It's not that any or all of those factors don't play a role, but to scapegoat them.
Yes.
And this is where you see, as a doctor, misdiagnosis is deadly. Misdiagnosis is very scary. But what we say then is, this is 1990 we're saying this. Rather, it's the Commission's view that a combination of factors coincided to allow the abuses to occur. Some of these were direct, such as the regressed sexuality of the offenders, their access to children, and the powerful status accorded to priests within the patriarchal church community. Others were indirect and worked in less obvious ways, some to protect the offenders and to inhibit public acknowledgement of the offenses. And then we go on to say each of these needs further study. We said that again and again and again. So we identified issues, and that's why when I didn't know if you were really asking me a question. The reason I'm still at it is because despite the fact, and the Canadian Church has been stellar in naming the issues. We've done it repeatedly. We've done it in the most recent 2018 new Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops, still saying, look at these underlying factors, but we haven't done it. So now let me tell you why I think we haven't done it, and I'm going to be a doctor again.
And you say we haven't done it. We haven't done what?
We haven't looked at the underlying factors, James. We haven't looked at the underlying factors. So I'll say this again, but let me say now because of your question. We have done, because you've asked me this, what have we done well? What have we done right? We have done policies, protocols, and the promotion of of safe environments, ministry environments, out the yin-yang. And Holy Father Pope Francis, whom I love dearly, okay, few things I want to nudge him on, but he understands the magnitude of he has an understanding here that is phenomenal about the church and the temptations of the church. But what I want to say is what we saw is that as we dealt with this issue, we named these issues, but we haven't yet acted on them. We've done the policies, protocol, safeguarding. In the philosophy sense, so I hang around with philosophers doing ethics, right? Policies, protocols, reporting, monitoring, these are necessary but not sufficient.
Amen.
To deal with the issue.
It's the tip of the iceberg.
What?
They deal with what's above the water. They don't deal with what's below the water.
Amen.
We say, and again, I got it, our Bishop Anthony Mancini chaired the revision that we just worked on, and I was advisor to that one, the CCCB 2018 safeguarding document. And we say there again, that it is an obligation to look at the underlying, this is the culture, policies, practices, beliefs, and relationships in the church that would have fostered either the abuse itself, so inappropriate formation of priests, inappropriate support of priests, or the profoundly inappropriate response. So that all that becomes part of the
And the
overlying
fact is,
issue.
I'm thinking around the similarities between the coaching pyramid that we look at in terms of parish renewal, because in parish renewal, people often come to us and what do they want to talk about? What are your policies and procedures? What are the things you do? And we're saying, okay, that's good. It's good to have good tools and use them properly and to have a good plan, but we primarily work with what's under the surface. And under the surface, you're talking about your leadership, you're talking about your culture.
Your character.
And your character. And the truth is that we had a culture of this, and it sounds horrible to say it. How can any organization, let alone a church, have a culture of abuse of minors? We did, and I can say that, although it was a hidden one, because it was tolerated. There was a toleration, and culture is shaped by what you celebrate. We certainly wasn't celebrated, but culture is shaped by what you tolerate. If you tolerate it, it grows and becomes a thing, even though it may be hidden.
Right. So, taking these last couple of comments, I interrupted my own. I interrupt myself all the time. It's rude, but I do it. I continue to do it. I was trying to show you the power of a medical metaphor to get at why is it. I'll answer you.
Come on.
I'll get there eventually. Why is it that we could name these issues again and again and again and not do them? In other words, not look at these underlying issues. So let me give you an example from medicine. Everybody knows there's acute illness.
Mm-hmm.
You're well, something happens. Trauma, car accident, acute infection. You have chronic illness. You have a diagnosis and it goes on and it affects you over time. But many people would have heard of epidemic. I mean, you can have an epidemic of flu virus. You can have an epidemic, right? Measles. We're having a measles outbreak right now. What people don't hear of is the profoundly important notion of endemic disease.
Endemic?
Endemic.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, so in medical metaphor, think, and this won't stretch anyone's imagination, in your mind now, see the last time you saw on television an advertisement for SOS Children's Villages, Chalice, Father's work here out from our diocese. Children, I mean, the first time I went to Africa, I'm a pediatrician. I was there for the World Health Organization on this huge conference on women and children. I never saw babies and children with profound protein malnutrition. It's called kwashiorkor and marasmus. You know the pictures you see of the little tiny head and the body that looks like a skeleton? And this is a 4-year-old who's the same weight as any one of our Canadian 18-month-olds. As a pediatrician, I could not believe seeing this. Now, in sub-Saharan Africa and many other places of the world, this malnutrition is not an acute event. Their mother is malnourished, their grandmother is malnourished, their great-grandmother is malnourished, their great-grandmother is malnourished. For them, health and vitality is a foreign concept because debility is the norm. Got it?
Church.
Got it? Wait. The metaphor for when I suddenly had this epiphany one night playing with medical metaphors, because this is why if you are enmeshed, there's also research from culture. My good friend, Father Jerry Arbuckle, Father Jerry is a Marist priest from Melbourne, Australia, and he's a social anthropologist. So Father Jerry will do the same thing, and he and I have huge overlap from social anthropology. But I'm using the medical metaphor because that's what I know. So what you know about endemic disease is that you don't know you're ill.
Right.
And what that absolutely then requires is that others have to help you to see and experience what health and well-being is.
But this, I think it was Pope Francis before the conclave. In his speech, he wrote on notes that I believe that was the particular time he said we've become what he called a self-referential church, and he defined that as a church in itself, of itself, for itself. And he said the self-referential church is a sick church, and I think that is a similar definition of an endemic mindset.
Yes.
Because see, the thing is, when the church becomes for itself, then the mission is no longer the mission of Jesus Christ. The mission is to protect and preserve the institution at all cost. And I think that certainly contributed to the culture. I mean, in a sense, the church seems to me, or some leaders in the church, reacted in the same way that a family oftentimes would in terms of the issue of shame and protecting our name. And let's try to deal with this, but let's try to keep a lid on it and not let people know about it because our reputation is at stake.
In fact, you are right. Every once in a while, you're right. And when that happens, Father James, when that happens, I'm more than happy to make note. Yeah. Because when it's not, I'll also make note. But this is really important because what you need to understand is that the protection of image. If you look at the history, and I've done this now since the 2012 book in detail and repeated, adding new stuff. Remember earlier we talked about a cultural response that transcended geographic and physical and cultural boundaries? All right. So that response can be characterized. Remember doctors take a history?
Yes.
And the reason they take the history is to find out clues in how did it start, what made it worse, does anything make it better, right? How did it change, did it progress? That's what you're doing from the head. Clues as to what's going on. So if you look at this issue and you go back to that history, what you see is some very interesting responses that are thematic, absolute, and are still continuing. Remember, 2/3 of the world still doesn't accept that sexual abuse of minors is a sin and a grave social issue. It's only emerging in most other countries of the world. It's not a crime. It's not a crime in most of the countries of the world. But what the response was, secrecy, don't talk about it, silence, denial, either denial that it happened. We even have mothers and fathers who, when the child went to them and said, Father Mark did something the other day in the sacristy, I wasn't comfortable. You wash your mouth out with soap. You punish their kids because the culture was, my God, don't you dare say a thing like that. Secrecy, silence, denial, minimization of the harm. That's the thing that rots my socks. We know. So when we still have dioceses, a whole bunch in the United States right now, who are trying not to have the statute of limitations relieved from this. Talk about a violation of justice. We know that when you are abused as a minor, so children and youth, that in fact it can take years before you can come to the stage, even with help, of being able to acknowledge that some of what might have been your lifelong pathology goes back to being abused. It's the psychological dynamic of this. It's because it happens at such a precious time in human development. So secrecy, silence, denial, minimization of harm, protection of image, protection of offender, protection of that. There was a management strategy of avoidance of scandal. And I just want to finish Father James, we've talked. Scandal in the biblical sense, a scandalon,
Yes.
in the biblical sense, is not reputational loss. It's not, oh God, don't say anything about this because people will think Father John is a sinner. People will think priests are sinners. Don't say anything. Reputational loss. Scandalon in Scripture is what Jesus would recognize. Scandalon is a stone. It's an
Stumbling
obstacle.
block.
To commit scandal in the biblical sense is to put an obstruction in the way of the individual to go to God in their pain.
Yep.
Remember the old man in Newfoundland?
Yep, that's right.
It was a scandal. He couldn't go to God.
Yep.
How many persons boys and girls, men and women, victim survivors, cannot go into a church? I have a victim that I've walked with. He can't even go past a church if there's sunlight that might shine on the stained glass windows. He can't come into the chapel at Caritas, the retirement center where I live, because we have this fantastic, beautiful stained glass window in the chapel of the Assumption. And I just love sitting there and watching the light come through. He can't do it. It's flashback. It's PT. It's post-traumatic stress disorder.
Thanks for tuning into the first part of our conversation with Sister Nuala Kenny. We hope you've enjoyed it. Join us next week for the second part. DR20 brings together parishes and pastors from across the world. This year, every attendee will receive a free year's membership to the Divine Renovation Network, our library of video resources for coaching, leadership, and parish renewal. For more details, go to divinerenovation.org/DR20.
It begins with a spark.
A feeling that there could be more.
That spark,
turns into a flame.
as the passion for renewal of your parish
Grows in your heart.
That flame grows into a fire.
Into a fire. The Holy Spirit is our fire.
Let's be a source of light.
A people called to save.
Followers that lead.